woman is killed when a car plows into the back of an illegally parked truck. Could there be a medical explanation for this tragic collision?
The driver's going at a high rate of speed, weaving from lane to lane in between cars.
Then a catastrophic rollover kills the driver of a pickup truck, but spares the life of his daughter riding in the passenger seat.
It would have caused a violent rotation. Within less than a second, the pickup truck was on its roof and slide.
Investigators struggle to explain what caused the accident and how one person could survive such a devastating wreck. And two drivers are involved in the death of a young girl riding her motorized scooter. Both admit to hitting her, but investigators must determine who dealt the fatal blow.
Something that really caught my eye was the length of the skid marks. Looked several hundred feet.
Every year, violent collisions kill 40,000 Americans and injure another 3 million. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
All too often, we forget that driving's not a right, it's a privilege. You may have paid for your car, your insurance, your license, but that doesn't mean you own the road. So when you're driving and you're not in complete control of your faculties, that's just reckless. And when I'm talking about your faculties, I mean more than alcohol and drugs. I'm talking about if you're supposed to wear glasses when you drive and you choose not to wear them, then you get in a wreck. Whose fault do you figure that is? Bottom line, alcohol, drugs, speeding, those aren't the only ways to end up facing a reckless driving charge or worse.
After a long day behind the wheel of his truck, Michael Morgan is getting tired and sleepy. It's about 70 miles to the next truck stop, and Morgan thinks that's a bit too far to risk driving any further. The trouble is, it's illegal to stop for a rest on the roadway. If he's caught, he could face a hefty fine. But given how heavy his eyelids are getting, Morgan decides to pull over and take a break for just a few minutes on a lightly traveled stretch of side road. He knows that almost 40% of truck accidents involve a sleepy driver, and he doesn't want to become a statistic. It's a decision Morgan will regret for the rest of his life. Barbara Shriver and her daughter Brooke are in a festive mood coming back from the movies. But the mood quickly shifts to panic and fear when Barbara notices a car zigzagging and coming up from behind at full speed.
Mom, what's going on? Mom.
In a matter of seconds, it catches up with them. And before they know what's happened, Barbara has lost control of her car. Up ahead, Michael Morgan's tractor-trailer comes into view, but it's too late. The Shrivers smash directly into the rear end at almost 60 miles per hour.
I received a call. They have an accident down here. A car into the back of a tractor trailer. A second vehicle involved aside from the tractor trailer, and there may be a fatality involved.
When accident investigator Frank Carson arrives at the collision scene, regular officers have blocked the street and secured the area. Barbara and Brooke have already been pulled out of their wrecked car and are on their way to the hospital. Barbara is in critical condition. She suffered a lot of head trauma and has bleeding under one of the membranes that protects the brain. She's also suffered bruises on her lungs. As for Brooke, she's luckier, having escaped with a broken arm, nose, and facial cuts. The car that came up from behind the Shrivers has been pulled over too, and Michael Morgan is also still on the scene, uninjured but numb from what just happened.
And all of a sudden, I hear boom. Get out of the vehicle.
The collision took place on a straight road under a clear sky, so there is no obvious explanation for this tragic event. Frank will have to figure out this one from scratch. But looking at the car under the truck, he immediately realizes why Barbara Shriver is fighting to stay alive. She was not wearing her seatbelt.
The passenger side of the vehicle was largely intact. The passenger compartment, the inside of the car where the passenger sat, was very little damage, and of course what helped the passenger immensely was the fact that the passenger was wearing a seatbelt.
The fact that the daughter survived this crash was due to her having worn her seatbelt and the airbags deploying. While airbags can cause some minor injuries, they're going to save more lives than they're going to take them. The deal is airbags and seatbelts go together. Airbags are a supplemental restraint to the use of seatbelts. Here's a couple of facts from a guy that's got 805. Make that 806 crashes under my seatbelt. An airbag deploys at about 200 miles an hour right near the steering wheel and the dash. And if you're not wearing a seatbelt, that's a lot of force you can hit with your upper body and with no restriction, no limits. Even when you're wearing a seatbelt, you can still suffer some abrasions on the inside of your arms from the rough airbag material itself. And in some cases, you can even break your wrist. Why is that? Because you could throw your arms up in front of your face like our pal the dummy here. This action can cause further damage, like broken noses and even broken arms. Hey, but you think those injuries are bad. Imagine how they'd be without seatbelts and airbags. Remember to buckle up.
Seatbags and airbags aside, what the Shrivers have experienced is one of the most deadly and violent collisions possible. What police call an underride.
Well, this bar that we're looking at here is called an underride protection bar. The truck drivers commonly call it an ICC bar because it's mandated by federal law. What it's designed to do is to keep the car from running underneath the tractor trailer. And if the car has a blunt front end, it works pretty well. Unfortunately, the modern vehicles are getting more aerodynamic, more low to the ground, more wedge shape, and they tend to run underneath the ICC bar. Rides underneath it, the ICC bar ends up in the passenger compartment and injuring the drivers and passengers a little bit more.
At this point, Frank Carson knows the obvious. The Shriver's car crashed into the back of the truck. The question now is why? Frank's focus shifts to other physical evidence, the tire marks. There are plenty of those in this case, and they are giving a pretty clear picture of what happened in the final few seconds before the Shriver slammed into the back of the trailer at high speed.
One of the first things I noticed when I got there was there were two tire marks leading in an arc from one of the lanes in the roadway right underneath the tractor trailer. So the first thing you know is that at some point, because the tire marks are in an arc, that the driver of the vehicle lost control for some reason. But there were two other tire marks that belonged to the third vehicle. And those marks led from what was the point of impact to the place where the vehicle came to a final rest.
There is a third car stopped at the scene, and it could offer clues to what happened. Frank goes to examine it.
The third car had very little damage to the front end. Very intact, could have started the car up and driven it away if you needed to.
That third car belongs to Denise French.
Ma'am, are you okay?
According to the police officer who first arrived at the crash, French was acting very strangely. She was eerily calm and seemed completely detached from what was going on. But there was no smell of alcohol on her breath or in her car.
Were you in this accident?
I don't remember. I don't think so.
You don't think so?
The interesting fact is the driver of the vehicle, who's conscious and talking to the officer at the scene when they arrived, lost consciousness before the paramedics arrived, which indicates she had some type of altered level of consciousness or some medical problem going on.
French loses consciousness before she's able to provide any useful information to the investigators. Unable to revive her, emergency personnel on the scene rush her to the hospital. At this point, they are unclear what caused her to collapse. It could be a reaction to drugs or alcohol, or she could have simply fainted as a result of traumatic shock.
The post-traumatic reaction to people at accidents vary from hysteria to very calm acceptance of what happened to not believing what happened. Everybody who's been in an automobile accident has that moment of, I don't know what's going on. Some people that's extended. You also have that situation, people are on different types of medications. The reactions vary, and part of the job that we have is determining when they reacted, how they reacted, and why they reacted that way.
Yeah,
But with Denise French on her way to the hospital, Frank is running out of leads. Fortunately, police soon get a break. Two witnesses arrive who claim to have seen everything. They report that Denise French was acting strangely well before the crash.
Behind me, they're going back and forth like they were weaving on the highway.
Carl Davis and Marianne Malloy were coming back from a halfway house where they volunteer every week. About 10 minutes after leaving, Carl noticed the headlights of a car that was being driven very strangely and dangerously.
I don't know, it's gonna cause an accident.
According to both witnesses, French passed them and went on to actually bump the Shriver's vehicle. Barbara then lost control of her car and crashed into the back of the truck.
The witnesses that I was able to talk to saw the striking vehicle being driven prior to the collision and described the driving behavior as very erratic. The driver's going at a high rate of speed, weaving from lane to lane in between cars, and at one point even past cars on the shoulder of the roadway to get around them. So they described very erratic behavior that's not normal behavior for a lot of people.
Well, I was on the passenger side, and he kept telling me to look at the lady. You know, she's weaving back and forth. She almost hit us.
One thing's for certain, in this instance, the woman hit the car in front of her. What we did here was a crash test where we had a closing speed, an overtaking speed of only about 12 miles an hour. The speed across the ground is one thing. It's that closing speed that's going to tell us how bad this crash was. And imagine if this was a higher closing speed crash, the rear end of the struck car, the car being overtaken, coming off the ground and going out of control. It can be pretty disastrous.
One vehicle rear-ended another vehicle, caused the driver to lose control, and unfortunately went underneath the rear end of a parked tractor trailer. We know how it happened. But then we have to look in the aspect with what the witnesses are telling us. We need to try and figure out why it happened, why this woman was driving erratically, why she lost control of her vehicle, why she lost consciousness at the scene after having talked to the police for a few moments. That have a profound effect on how we decide to pursue the legal matter and the charges against the person.
Carson's first step in finding an explanation for Denise French's erratic actions is to examine the inside of her car. There are no signs of alcohol bottles or drugs, but something does catch his attention.
One of the first things I noticed when I looked inside of the vehicle, there was a lot of sugary sodas, hard candy, there were pastries in the car, and all over the place, in the glove compartment, in the center console, on the front seat, on the back seat. And there are a lot of people who have a sweet tooth, but they don't normally keep that amount of sugary candy with them.
We all have certain experiences that bring about certain stereotypes. We expect to see the sports car pulled over by police. What doesn't fit that stereotype would be a middle-aged woman driving what would appear to be recklessly down the road. For police on the scene, they're going to draw on their experience. They're going to draw from the physical evidence, and they're going to bring it all together. But if something doesn't add up, there's usually a reason.
As Frank wraps up his on-scene investigation, an officer comes to tell him bad news. Barbara Shriver has just died of her injuries.
Just got confirmation from the dispatcher. The woman in the car accident just died.
Okay.
What Carson still can't figure out is why her car got bumped in the first place.
With the death of Barbara Shriver, all the attention's focused on the other driver, Denise French. It's not clear why a middle-aged woman traveling alone would suddenly start driving erratically. It's also not clear why she seems unaware of the consequences of the crash. Depending on answers to those mysteries, Denise French may be headed for prison.
Coming up, startling new information in Denise French's medical records forces a dramatic turn in the investigation.
The driver told me that she started feeling bad and she thought that she would get off at the next exit.
And later, investigators replicate a deadly rollover crash, hoping to find out how one passenger walked away unharmed. Barbara Shriver and her daughter Brooke were driving home on an unremarkable evening. They never made it. Shriver's car piled into the back of a tractor trailer after being hit from behind by a driver who was weaving all over the roadway. It's now Frank Carson's job to find out why.
Frank's just learned some unfortunate news. Barbara Shriver died as a result of her injuries. Now his job's going to be to figure out why Denise French's car rear-ended Shriver's. Now, what he determines will help a prosecutor decide if criminal charges should be filed against French. But more than that, it can help provide much-needed closure for the Shriver family.
Frank Carson gets a phone call from the hospital. Denise French, who had passed out shortly after the collision with Shriver's car, is awake again. At the hospital, French reveals that she is a type 1 diabetic.
What happened?
You've been in an auto accident.
I'm a diabetic.
Diabetes is a disease in which the body does not produce or properly use insulin, a hormone that is necessary to convert sugars, starches, and other food into energy. As a former emergency medical technician, Frank Carson has seen his share of diabetic episodes.
When your blood sugar level gets very low, most people realize that as hunger, or if you get really hungry, you get the shakes. With a diabetic, the reaction can be a little bit different.
Again, Frank Carson's medical background helps him play out possible scenarios that would explain her actions before the crash and her attitude afterwards. He starts to wonder whether she was having a diabetic crisis.
Normally, if diabetics, the sugar level drops too low in their bloodstream, they don't get that sugar that they need from hard candy or soda, they'll start feeling agitated, they'll start becoming disoriented, perhaps hallucinating, and eventually they'll begin to lose consciousness and pass out, and then it becomes a real health crisis for them, whether they're driving or whether they're at home doing the dishes.
It's possible an insulin imbalance led to this tragedy. But one thing doesn't add up. French's car was full of soda and snacks that would have temporarily brought her levels back up. And not a single bottle or bag had been opened.
For someone that's lived with this disease as long as this lady has, and made the plan she obviously has made carrying this around with her, it doesn't make sense that she wouldn't take advantage of the solution. It was right here in front of her.
So the first thing that you think of is there's some negligence involved. Here's a person who's been a diabetic for 20 years and may not have been managing their condition as well as they could have.
Frank Carson has collected all the clues that the crash scene can offer. With Denise French awake, the next answers will have to come from her. He goes to interview her at the hospital. But what he hears only deepens the mystery. Denise French doesn't believe she had a diabetic crisis.
The driver told me that she had missed her exit where she was going to. She had gotten lost, so she decided to keep going, and she started feeling bad, and she thought that she would get off at the next exit to try and find some place where she could stop and take something to eat, perhaps to get over this feeling, see what was wrong with her, and that's what she remembers.
But Denise French also admits something very important to the outcome of this investigation. She says she doesn't keep a log of her daily diet, her blood sugar level, her insulin intake. The fact that she isn't doing this basic activity may add up to outright negligence in terms of this crash.
Denise French may be looking at a charge of reckless driving causing death. But as Frank Carson assembles the evidence to present to the prosecutor, he uncovers something startling. It might even mean a 180-degree turn in terms of the possible reckless driving charge. As always, Frank Carson asks to see the medical records of the drivers involved in the accident. And that's where he finds an explanation, not only for French's behavior behind the wheel, but why she couldn't feel a diabetic attack coming on in the first place.
She had, within the past several weeks, been diagnosed with high blood pressure or hypertension, and she was prescribed medication to help control that. One's a diuretic, and the other type is called beta blockers. Beta blockers work by regulating the way the heart beats, lowers the heart rate so your blood pressure lowers. Because what beta blockers do is they will tend to mask or not allow the diabetic to realize that they're having their diabetic crisis. It masks the normal clues that they would have. And that appeared to have been the case with this lady.
Frank Carson's conclusions are simple. The beta blockers masked the normal warning signs of a diabetic crisis and left Denise French helpless to prevent it. Put her behind the wheel in this condition, and it's almost inevitable that something bad would result. In this case, the outcome was tragic. As symptoms of disorientation and fatigue set in, French begins zigzagging all over the road. Speeding up from behind, she rear-ends Barbara Shriver, who crashes into a parked tractor-trailer. Her daughter survives, but Barbara dies as the result of massive internal bleeding. No charges were filed against the driver of the rig or Denise French. As for the doctor who prescribed the beta blocker, the Shriver family ultimately decided not to sue.
Driving requires your full attention. You're operating heavy machinery. In this case, this woman learned a hard lesson about the interaction and the side effects of even over-the-counter drugs. Read the label. That label's going to tell you what's going on, and it can save your life.
Coming up, a young girl is killed when her motorized scooter collides with two vehicles. Witnesses say she caused the crash, but investigators suspect she wasn't the only reckless driver involved. And next, a deadly rollover kills one man, but leaves his daughter unharmed. Investigators struggle to determine the cause of the crash and how anyone could have survived.
Planning a crash test is no small undertaking. We usually spend a good bit of the day equipping the cars, and in this case it's particularly challenging because we're going to be trying for a rollover. Rollovers aren't as easy as folks think. You may have an SUV, you may have wet roads, you may have a lot of conditions that folks think of as relating to rollovers, but they don't always come together to make a rollover occur just as you'd expect. Same thing occurs to investigators in the field. They may be really good investigators, and I may have a really good crash crew, and all of those things should work together. But sometimes, for the investigator in the field, there are convoluted factors that make their investigations pretty difficult.
Carl Webster and his daughter Samantha are trying to find something they can agree on. Together, they're planning a surprise 60th birthday party for Samantha's mother. But just drawing up a guest list is a monumental challenge.
We should invite Judy next door.
And then suddenly, in mid-sentence, their whole world is violently turned upside down. Despite the fact that he was wearing a seatbelt, Carl Webster is killed instantly, his upper body crushed as the truck rolls over and slides off the road. Outside on the grass, his daughter is virtually unscathed, but in a state of shock, having survived one of the strangest accidents investigators here have ever seen. As Samantha is rushed to the hospital, accident investigator Mark Wright arrives on the scene. He and his team of specialists are responsible for putting the pieces of this puzzle together. Why did the pickup flip over? Were any other cars involved? And how could one lucky passenger escape with only minor injuries? Right now, all he has to go on is a mangled truck and a trail of debris.
There are a number of conditions that can bring on a rollover. Driver behavior, reckless driving would be one. A roadway condition or even a mechanical issue might cause one of these very violent events. And when you're ejected in a rollover, you're 4 times more likely to be killed than if you stay inside the car. In this case, the ejected occupant actually survives and the person that stays in the car is killed. And that's just one anomaly here. For the investigators, though, the key is to start with figuring out how this crash happened.
They don't generally just roll over for no reason. There's usually either a violent steering action or hit something that caused them to trip and roll over. When I look at the pickup truck, I'm looking for scuffing on the actual tires themselves and scrapes on the rims to see what may have contacted the road in a violent steering maneuver. I'm looking for damage to the vehicle itself. That'll show me what direction it was sliding and the orientation of the vehicle, and then helps me to know what to look for on the road as well.
Unfortunately, the inspection of the truck offers Mark Wright no obvious explanation as to why this pickup suddenly began tumbling out of control. His next step is to begin the painstaking examination of a field of debris that stretches back almost 200 feet from the wreck.
Just immediately leading up to where the pickup truck was paint transfer on the asphalt. And that's pretty typical of a vehicle that's on its roof. Before that, I saw some tire marks, and that's typical of a hard steer maneuver. Just before that, there was actually a circular scratch on the road surface. There was actually 2 of them, and they looked like 2 circular wheels.
2 circular impressions imprinted on the asphalt baffle Mark Wright and his team of investigators. Everything else in the debris field clearly came from Carl Webster's truck. But the source of these marks and the role they played in the crash is a complete mystery.
So Mark, you've got a complex scene here with a lot of physical evidence. Have you sorted this out? Have you ruled anything out yet?
Yes, I looked at the vehicle itself, and I've ruled out that it's been involved in a collision with any other vehicle.
Have you got a working theory so far?
Yes, I do. Actually, we've got a tire scrub and a circular impact mark on the ground, which does not come from the involved pickup truck. So my theory at this point is that it's hit something to cause it to go out of control.
And you haven't found that yet?
No, we have not.
While the team searches for anything that may have left the impressions in the road, Mark Wright sets out to find the speed of the pickup truck at the point of impact. With no evidence to suggest Carl Webster was impaired, knowing his speed will allow investigators to better understand the crash. They'll know how suddenly a hazard would have appeared to Webster and why a minor impact produced such a devastating crash.
Energy is equal to 1/2 mass times velocity squared. It's a very elementary equation that a lot of accident investigators learned in high school and middle school, but probably thought they'd never use again. Turns out, for accident reconstruction, this is a very useful model. We know the energy. We can figure out how much energy is used up skidding the car or doing damage. We know the mass. We know the weights of the car. So there's two of the unknowns. The last value, speed, that's what we're a lot of times solving for. And if we know these two, we can get to that one.
Mark determines that Carl Webster and his daughter Samantha were doing just 50 miles per hour in the seconds before their pickup struck an object in the road, flipped onto its roof, and began rolling across the road. As the on-scene investigation wraps up, Mark Wright is left to wonder about just what Carl Webster hit and whether he saw it in his final seconds or was oblivious to the danger.
So you're driving down the road and you're faced with debris. You have two choices. You can swerve or you can hit it. Swerving can cause its own problems, depending on your speed, the roadway conditions, the type of vehicle you're in. A swerve could put you out of control. On the other hand, hitting it may be the lesser of two evils. So in this case, did our driver actually choose to hit what was in the roadway? We can't really tell for sure until we know what it is he hit.
The next morning, officers search in the fields surrounding the crash site for any object that may have come into contact with the pickup truck. An object heavy enough to initiate a rollover on impact, but small enough to be invisible to a driver at night.
We found this tire about 350 meters off the roadway in a farmer's field. And what we were trying to do is determine, did this tire have anything to do with the actual collision? What we did find was a gash in the tire and other damage to the rim that corresponds to rim damage to the front tire of this pickup truck. And also, we found an area of cleaning on the leaf spring itself. It's actually damaged. So we've been able to determine that this tire was impacted by the front tire of the pickup truck and then contacted the leaf spring on the pickup truck. The tire would have caused a violent rotation. In this case, it rotated counterclockwise within less than a second. The pickup truck was on its roof and sliding.
How this tire wound up in the middle of a high-speed road may never be answered, but it's now clear that it caused the rollover that took Carl Webster's life. Although the front end of the pickup was able to skip over the tire, the rear end could not, and the force of the impact with the back wheels was enough to send the truck tumbling across the road. But this discovery only gives rise to more questions. With one mystery solved, Mark Wright must turn his attention to Samantha Webster's miraculous story of survival. Coming up, investigators examine Samantha's still buckled seatbelt. If she was wearing it, just how did she end up outside the truck? And if she was actually ejected from the truck, just how did she survive? Reenacting a destructive rollover just might give investigators the answers they need. And later, two drivers admit to hitting a young girl who was driving her motorized scooter down the middle of the road. But their stories and those of eyewitnesses clash with the evidence police find at the scene.
I was going to be looking at an investigation that involved high speed, grossly over the 30 miles per hour.
Collisions with debris in the roadway are a daily occurrence. A lot of times they end up causing pretty dramatic crashes. In this case, we have a truck that hits a spare tire that's left in the roadway, results in a really, really bad rollover. The driver staying in the car is actually killed, and the passenger who was ejected walks away with minor injuries. Usually it's the other way around. This is a pretty amazing case.
The forces experienced by occupants in a rollover are catastrophic. Anyone unrestrained is powerless to keep themselves in the car. Ejected through a window, victims often suffer severe head and neck injuries when they hit the ground, or are killed when the vehicle itself rolls over them. Even if they're belted in like Carl Webster, they can be crushed if the roof caves in on them. But investigators are stumped by Samantha Webster's remarkable story of survival. Her physical injuries suggest she was not in the wreck that killed her father. Police hope she can tell them exactly how and when she escaped the truck.
Recollection of the passenger was that they were just driving along normal. They were just talking, and all of a sudden she finds herself in the ditch.
I just remember the truck kind of like bouncing off to one side a bit, and then it just started rolling.
So she really didn't have a huge recollection of what even happened. They didn't see or hear anything. It was just on the roof and off the road. She doesn't know how she got out of the pickup. She was just out and in the grass.
Samantha Webster's description of the crash reminds investigators that rollovers occur in a fraction of a second and at speeds beyond our level of perception. Coupled with the incredible forces she experienced, it's little wonder Samantha is unable to describe her experience in detail. To understand what she may have gone through will require duplicating a rollover on a closed stretch of highway.
First attempt got both front tires off.
Yeah. I cheated more.
You cheated closer to the fog line.
Cheated more, yeah. Just like someone correcting and bringing it back on the road. We have to get the wheels off the road and then have to bring it back on.
Yep.
So we get the left, the right steer, but it's got to be off the road.
We need that change in friction surfaces on all the tires.
As you can see, this one just slid. Yeah. As long as this one just slid, we're not going to get it.
Yes, we got more dig from the front tires on the first attempt.
Now that's the way it should work.
That was 3 complete turns and it landed on its feet just like a cat. Now look at the big impact on the passenger side on the off side of the roll. That would not be very friendly for the passenger.
No, this is ugly. Rollovers are incredibly violent events. Once where I had 4 or 5 inches of headroom, all of a sudden now on this side I find I have next to none. But still in all, seat belts are going to save your life. They're going to keep you in the car and protect you, keep you from moving to the roof when the roof's on the ground, and that's the best protection, much better than being out on the road.
The damage done to the SUV during the rollover test only reinforces the unlikelihood of Samantha Webster's miraculous escape. But Mark Wright has spent the better part of an afternoon examining the wreck of the pickup, and he now has a theory as to how Samantha was able to beat the odds and survive.
We were able to conclude that coupled between the seat belt, it's attached to the B-pillar, and when the vehicle rolled over, the B-pillar was compromised, and that created some slack in the seat belt, and that, along with the seat braking itself, created more slack. So the seat belt did its job initially in the initial rollover to hold the passenger in place, but on the second impact, when the pickup truck actually left the road and went into the ditch, there was enough slack that the passenger was ejected through the passenger side window. Fortunately for her, the ditch was soft grass, the ground was moist, and it was able to assist her in not sustaining any serious injuries.
Typically, if a person's ejected, they come to an immediate deceleration because they hit another stationary object. That individual then will sustain massive acceleration, deceleration, rotation forces on the brain, leading to eventually brain death. In this scenario, what happened was that there was a slower deceleration because the person was perhaps sliding along the grass, and those types of deceleration forces that one associates with severe brain injury did not occur.
Mark Wright arrived on the scene of a fatal rollover and found more questions than answers. But with the last piece of the puzzle in place, he is finally able to say exactly how this tragedy unfolded. Carl Webster is driving his pickup at about 50 miles an hour. Suddenly, he hits a fully inflated tire lying in the middle of the road. The front end of the pickup immediately bounces, raising the rear wheels. When they touch back down, the left rear spring cuts into the tire, forcing the truck onto its side and into a deadly rollover. Samantha's life is saved in those first milliseconds by her seatbelt, which holds her firmly in place. But the roll is so violent, it smashes the roof and rips her seat from its moorings, providing a momentary slack in the belt. This allows Samantha to be ejected out of the passenger window and onto the soft roadside grass. Had she stayed in the truck, she would have most likely been crushed to death. Although grateful to have survived, Samantha Webster doesn't dwell on how lucky she is. Her own survival is a daily reminder of the night she lost her father.
The other interesting aspect of this crash was that spare tire in the roadway. You have to wonder how many people drove by that without hitting it. Drivers have a responsibility to secure the load in their vehicles. They also have a responsibility to get things out of the roadway that come off their vehicles when it's safe to do so. In either case, we wouldn't have known all of that had it not been for the good work of Mark Wright and the other investigators involved.
Next, a young girl is struck by two drivers while riding her motorized scooter. Both say they couldn't avoid the collision. The physical evidence says otherwise.
I got to the scene. Something that really caught my eye was the length of the skid marks.
I'm sure you've seen it before. A kid as young as 9 or 10 on a scooter zooming in and out of the streets and intersections. Makes you ask yourself, when are we old enough to be a responsible driver? Well, you'll get an answer in this next story.
Stacy Wilson can't believe her good luck. Her best friend Heather has just let her borrow a brand new motorized scooter for the first time. The 14-year-old is a bit wobbly on it, but gets going okay. After a quick loop through the neighborhood, she's just a few blocks away from home, but she'll never get there. Stacy's scooter drifts into the wrong lane of traffic with tragic consequences.
The information we had was that it was a young girl was dead at the scene from being hit by at least 2 vehicles. When you find out that a young life is gone, it really affects you. You still got to put your emotions aside and do your investigation. But again, the kids are the worst.
John Heineman leads the vehicular crime unit at the local police department. When he gets to the scene, Stacy Wilson's body is still there. A car and an SUV have pulled over as well, and both drivers have admitted to hitting the young victim. It may seem like a simple case of a little girl losing control of her scooter, but John has his work cut out for him.
Hi, I'm Sergeant John Hyman with the Phoenix PD's Vehicular Crimes Unit.
It's his job to uncover the precise chain of events leading up to the accident and make certain that everyone involved is telling the truth.
Which vehicle were you driving?
I was in the first vehicle.
The sedan?
Yes.
The first driver I started talking to was the driver of the car involved in the collision. It was the first vehicle that the GoPed hit. And you were driving the SUV?
Yeah, it's right behind her.
Okay. What I'm going to first do is I'm going to interview each separately. I'll start with you.
Stephanie Jackson is the driver of the car. She is traumatized by what happened. After all, she has 2 children herself.
When I started the interview with the first driver, she told me she was going down the street approximately 30 miles per hour, the speed limit. Saw this GoPed. She pulled off to the side, but not in time. The GoPed sideswiped her, causing the GoPed to go to the right, or the GoPed fell to the ground.
Jackson insists that she did all she could to avoid the collision.
And so I veered off and had to swerve off of the road.
Emergency workers on the scene suggest that Stacy head injuries are one of the most common causes of accident fatalities.
Once the head is hit by a moving object, it accelerates very quickly, and then usually will decelerate once it hits the ground very quickly. The abrupt acceleration and deceleration of the soft brain within the hard skull causes massive injury in the nerves and the blood vessels throughout the brain. There's massive swelling in the brain because of the injury to the small nerves and the blood vessels. That swelling or edema within the brain can actually increase the pressure inside of the brain to such an extent that the heart is unable to pump blood flow to the brain adequately. In that case, what will happen is that the brain will eventually die.
To verify Jackson's story, Heineman examines her car. There are clear signs of the impact. A black scratch mark along the side of the vehicle appears to be consistent with the driver's explanation that the scooter and the car came in contact.
There was alcohol, but we didn't drink.
Hindman also has witnesses. Bridget Turnbull and her brother James were walking down the street when they saw Stacy pass by on her motorized scooter. James gives the most detailed testimony.
As soon as the GoPed rider passed by him, he looked back, knew he was going to hit this car, and saw the collision with the sedan and the GoPed.
The witnesses appear to confirm that it was young Stacy who hit the car, just as the driver said.
Did you see
the next interview is with Kathy Morgan, the driver of the second vehicle involved. Morgan is also in shock. She was following the car in her SUV and saw the car brake and pull over. The next thing she knows, there's a young child lying on the roadway in front of her. Morgan hits the brakes, but could not avoid running over Stacy.
Kathy, as you were behind your friend, how fast were you going?
I was going the speed limit, like 30 or 35.
She said that she was going the speed limit, maybe just a little faster, but no more than 10 miles faster. 30 to 40 miles max.
I mean, I couldn't see anything in front of me. I mean, I tried to stop as fast as I could.
So everyone appears to be singing the same song here. They've all got the same story going. The little girl's riding this motorized toy vehicle down the middle of the road. The two drivers, they tried to avoid her. They just couldn't. Case closed, right? No. Turns out the physical evidence is telling us someone is responsible for the little girl's death.
Some people think that, these automobiles, they're just accidents. And the criminal charges aren't warranted because it's just an accident. Well, they're not accidents, they're collisions or crimes.
In any crash, what the drivers say and what the witnesses claim they saw can help investigators determine what happened. But the strongest stories are always told by the physical evidence. Injuries to bodies, marks on the vehicles. It doesn't lie. And in the investigator's mind, that physical evidence is adding up quite differently than what at least one of the people involved is saying.
Something that really caught my eye was the length of the skid marks. Looked several hundred feet in length. Knowing this was a residential street with a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, 200 feet of skid marks is going to put the speed up around 60 miles an hour of this vehicle, twice the speed limit that was the posted speed.
John measures the skid marks, and as he expected, they confirm his doubts. The driver of the SUV was well over the speed limit before she ran over the child.
Skid marks on the roadway. In police work, we call that a clue. It's a clue that tells us she was on the brakes trying to stop the car. She's probably too inexperienced to realize that skidding, you're just going to go in a straight line. If she'd let her foot off the brake, she probably could have steered, regained control, and avoided the crash.
Looking at the evidence on the road, the skid marks, I knew that driver was reacting to something, and they hit her brakes hard. And had she been going that speed limit, she would have stopped in ample time to avoid the impact with the young girl on the road.
Now, whether that would have saved Stacy's life is a crucial issue here. The little girl did hit her head on the pavement after bouncing off the car. But Hindman doesn't know yet which impact actually caused the child's death. Depending on the answer to that question, one of these drivers may be looking at some jail time.
Coming up, investigator John Hindman turns to an expert in biomechanics to build his case against one of the drivers. The parents of 14-year-old Stacy Wilson are looking for answers after a tragic accident on a nearby residential street. The investigation so far has shown that Stacy's motorized scooter ran into the side of a car, knocking her backward onto the roadway. An SUV following close behind could not stop before running her over. After measuring the skid marks, accident investigator John Hindman has determined that the SUV was going nearly double the speed limit. A lot of factors can affect how a vehicle behaves when a driver hits the brakes. The condition of the road, the weather, wear and tear on the brakes themselves. All of those factors may play a role here.
Since it was a criminal investigation, took the SUV and did a series of skid tests. 3 of the skid tests at 50 miles per hour, 60 miles per hour, and 40 miles per hour. Took all 3 tests, came up with my values that I needed for the investigation.
Drivers don't realize what a difference 10, 15 miles an hour makes when it comes time to brake. It can be the difference between a good scare and a guilty conscience.
What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this car and I'm gonna skid at 30 and then 50. See how much difference it really does make.
Obviously, the faster a vehicle is traveling, the harder it is to control in a skid. At this point, it's John Heineman's opinion that Kathy Morgan, the driver of the SUV, should be charged with vehicular manslaughter.
5 miles per hour. Kathy, I had a chance to look at the investigation. I know the GoPad's on the wrong side of the road, but I have an issue with your speed.
I told you I was going the speed limit.
You're not going 30 or 35. Just your skid alone has you at 60 to 65 miles per hour.
I was not. There was nothing I could do. It wasn't my fault.
It's going to be a homicide investigation.
What?
And the case is going to be sent to the county attorney's office.
I didn't do anything. I didn't mean to hit that girl.
Young girl died. And had they been going 30 miles an hour, the speed limit, nothing would have happened. They would never even impacted that victim. So we got an obligation to the victim to set forth the criminal proceedings and put the criminal justice system in motion. You know, maybe harsh, but there's consequences with everything.
The next step is to determine exactly how the victim was killed.
To get a conviction, John's going to have to show that it wasn't the first impact and fall to the ground that killed the little girl, but rather the second impact with the SUV. To do that, he's going to go to a biomechanical expert for a head drop test.
Biomechanical experts examine how both internal and external forces impact the human body. The head drop test will help determine if the force of Stacy's fall after the first collision with the car caused her fatal skull fracture.
John, what we have here is a drop tower. This will allow us then to look at the question, in this case, of whether or not falling over could have produced the head injury that we see in the victim. And this is what it looks like. What we saw in the head drop experiment, John, was the force that results strictly from a fall. And we demonstrated on the basis of magnitude that that would be insufficient to produce any kind of major head injury, certainly not a fatal one.
Remember that Stacy was wearing a helmet, which significantly reduces the impact and the injuries caused by the fall alone. And that is only one of the elements that leads Kerry Knapp to his conclusions that Stacy could not have died as a result of her fall. Her head injuries reveal another story.
What you get in a broad-based strike like that is, if you get anything, you get a very large, round depression. And in this particular case, what we had is a very, very severe skull fracture in this area with multiple depressed fragments. That requires not only a lot of energy, but a very focal strike. There's only one source of high velocity, high energy focal strike, and that would be strike by the following SUV.
Right.